I still remember the exact words the doctor said to me. "Anna, we've done everything we can." The room suddenly felt smaller. The white walls seemed to close in around me. I looked at my mother sitting beside my hospital bed, and for the first time in my life, I saw pure fear in her eyes. Not worry, not concern. Fear. The kind of fear a parent feels when they might lose their child. At 22 years old, I should have been planning my future. I should have been worrying about college assignments, first jobs, relationships, and dreams. Instead, I was sitting in a hospital room in Indianapolis, Indiana, listening to doctors tell me there was almost no hope left. And yet, what happened next changed everything. Not just my life, my faith, my family, and the way I understand miracles. My name is Anna Carter. I was born and raised in a small town outside Indianapolis. My childhood was simple. We weren't rich. We weren't famous. But we were happy. My father, Daniel Carter, worked as an electrician. My mother, Rebecca Carter, was a kindergarten teacher. Every Sunday, our family attended church. Faith was always part of our lives. But if I'm honest, when I became a teenager, God became less important to me. I still believed. I still prayed occasionally. But Jesus became more of a background figure in my life than the center of it. Like many young people, I thought I had plenty of time. Time to pursue God later, time to get serious about faith later, time to think about eternity later. Life felt endless. I had no idea how quickly everything could change. The first sign appeared shortly after my 21st birthday. I began feeling tired all the time, not normal tired, exhausted. No matter how much sleep I got, I woke up feeling drained. At first, I blamed stress, then college, then work. But the fatigue kept getting worse. Soon headaches followed, then dizziness, then unexplained pain. I started missing classes, missing work shifts, missing social events. Friends stopped inviting me places because I was always canceling. My parents became worried. "Anna, something isn't right," my mom kept saying. I agreed, but I never imagined how serious it would become. The first doctor ordered blood tests, then more blood tests, then scans, then specialist appointments. Weeks turned into months, no answers, only questions. Meanwhile, my condition worsened. One afternoon, I collapsed in a grocery store. The next thing I remember was waking up in an ambulance. My mother was crying. My father looked pale, and suddenly everyone was moving very quickly. More tests, more scans, more specialists. Finally, one rainy Thursday afternoon, we got an answer. The answer none of us wanted. I remember sitting across from Dr. Michael Turner. He was one of the best specialists in the state. His expression told me the news before he even spoke. He folded his hands carefully, took a deep breath, and then said words that shattered my world. "Anna, we've identified a very aggressive condition affecting multiple systems in your body." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. My mother grabbed my hand. My father looked at the floor. The doctor continued explaining medical terms I barely understood. But one sentence stood out. One sentence echoed in my head for weeks. "This condition is extremely rare." Rare. The word sounded harmless, but it wasn't. Rare meant fewer treatments, fewer specialists, fewer success stories, less hope. Over the next several months, my life became a cycle of hospitals, medications, procedures, and uncertainty. The girl who once dreamed of traveling the world could barely walk across a room. The girl who loved hiking with friends now needed help climbing stairs. The girl who laughed constantly now spent most nights crying herself to sleep. I tried to stay positive. I really did. But positivity becomes difficult when pain becomes your daily companion. One evening, I sat alone in my bedroom. Rain tapped against the window. The room was dark, except for a small lamp. I looked around at photographs from happier times, birthday parties, graduation, family vacations, church retreats, pictures of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And for the first time in years, I prayed. Not a polite prayer, not a routine prayer, a desperate prayer. "Jesus, if you're real, please help me." The words felt awkward, small, broken, but they were honest, and sometimes honesty is where faith begins. The following months became even harder. The disease continued progressing, new complications appeared, my weight dropped dramatically, my strength disappeared. Eventually, I had to stop attending college entirely. I moved back home with my parents. At 22 years old, I felt like my life was moving backward. Friends were graduating, getting engaged, starting careers, building futures. Meanwhile, I was struggling to make it through a single day. the emotional pain became almost worse than the physical suffering. I began asking questions I never thought I'd ask. Why me? Why would God allow this? What purpose could there possibly be in all this pain? Some days I felt angry, other days numb, other days terrified. But through everything, my mother remained faithful. Every night she prayed beside my bed. Every single night. Even when I couldn't pray, even when I didn't want to pray. She prayed. One night I asked her something. "Mom, what if God says no?" She looked at me for a long moment, then gently brushed hair away from my face, and said something I'll never forget. "Anna, sometimes God's greatest miracles aren't changing our circumstances. Sometimes they're changing our hearts while we're going through them." At the time, I didn't understand. I wanted healing, not wisdom. I wanted answers, not lessons. I wanted my old life back. But God was preparing me for something far bigger than I could see. As winter arrived, my condition reached its lowest point. Hospital admissions became more frequent. Complications became more serious. The doctors became increasingly concerned. One evening, I overheard two nurses talking outside my room. They didn't realize I could hear them. What they said made my blood run cold. One nurse quietly asked, "Do you think she'll make it?" The other hesitated, then shook her head. That moment broke me, completely. For the first time, death felt real, not something distant, not something that happened to other people, something standing directly in front of me, waiting, watching, and I was terrified. That night I cried harder than I ever had before. I cried until I had no tears left. Then I looked up at the hospital ceiling and whispered, "Jesus, if you're there, I need you now." I had no idea that prayer would become the beginning of the greatest miracle of my life. And I had no idea that within weeks doctors would witness something they couldn't explain, something that would leave an entire hospital stunned. The next morning I woke up exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. It felt as if every ounce of hope had drained out of me during the night. The conversation I had overheard between the nurses kept replaying in my mind. "Do you think she'll make it?" "Probably not." Those words echoed through my thoughts like a storm. I stared out the hospital window at the gray Indiana sky. People walked outside carrying coffee cups. Cars moved through the parking lot. Life continued, but mine felt frozen. For the first time since my diagnosis, I genuinely believed I might die. My parents arrived early that morning. My mother carried her Bible. My father carried a forced smile that fooled nobody. When they entered the room, I immediately knew something was wrong. They had been crying. I could see it in their eyes. My father sat beside me. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, he took my hand. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "the doctors want to discuss some options." The moment he said options, I knew what that meant. The treatments weren't working. The medications weren't helping. The situation was becoming desperate. Later that afternoon, Dr. Michael Turner entered my room with several other specialists. Their faces looked serious. Too serious. I already knew what was coming. The lead physician sat down beside my bed. "Anna," he began gently, "we've reviewed all your recent tests." I nodded. My heart pounded. He continued, "The disease continues progressing despite treatment." My mother lowered her head. My father squeezed my shoulder. The doctor hesitated before speaking again, and then came the words that changed everything. "We may be running out of medical options." The room went silent. I felt numb, completely numb. The doctors continued explaining experimental treatments and possible complications. But honestly, I barely heard any of it. One sentence drowned out everything else. "We may be running out of medical options." After they left, I stared at the wall for hours. No television, no phone, no conversation, just silence. That evening, my pastor visited. His name was Pastor James Whitaker. He had known me since childhood. He had dedicated me as a baby, baptized me as a teenager, and now he sat beside my hospital bed when I needed him most. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a simple question. "Anna, how are you really doing?" The question broke something inside me. I started crying, not polite tears, not controlled tears, deep, painful sobs. Months of fear came pouring out, months of frustration, months of unanswered questions. "I don't understand," I cried. "I've prayed." My voice trembled. "My family has prayed." I looked at him through tears. "Our church has prayed." I could barely breathe. "So why isn't God answering?" The room fell silent. Pastor James didn't rush to answer. Instead, he opened his Bible. After a moment, he read from Psalm 34. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Then he looked directly at me. "Anna, God hasn't abandoned you." I wanted to believe him, but my circumstances screamed otherwise. Still, something about his calm confidence brought a tiny spark of peace. Before leaving, he prayed over me. Not for healing, at least not immediately. First, he prayed for strength, then courage, then peace, and finally healing. That prayer stayed with me. Over the next several days, something strange began happening. Not physically, spiritually. Despite my worsening condition, I started feeling God's presence in ways I never had before. During the quiet hours of the night, I found myself reading scripture. Verses I had ignored for years suddenly felt alive. Words that once seemed ordinary became deeply personal. One verse especially captured my heart, Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Hope. The word felt impossible. And yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. One night around 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep. The pain was severe. Machines beeped softly around me. The hospital hallway was quiet. Everyone else seemed asleep. I closed my eyes and began praying. Not asking for healing, not asking for answers, just talking to Jesus. For nearly an hour, I poured out everything, my fears, my anger, my disappointment, my confusion. And then something happened. It's difficult to explain. I didn't hear an audible voice. I didn't see a vision. But suddenly an overwhelming sense of peace filled the room. A peace unlike anything I had ever experienced. The pain remained, the illness remained, the uncertainty remained, but the fear was gone, completely gone. For the first time in months, I felt safe. I felt held. I felt loved. And somehow I knew Jesus was with me. The next morning, the nurses immediately noticed something different. "You seem happier today," one of them said. I smiled. For the first time in a long time, the smile was genuine. Days passed, then a week, then another. Physically, I still struggled, but spiritually I was changing. My hospital room slowly became a place of prayer. Visitors came regularly. Church members stopped by. Friends visited. People prayed. Lots of people prayed. Some brought food for my family. Others brought encouraging notes. One elderly woman from church wrote me a letter. Inside, she included a simple sentence. "Never underestimate what God can do in one moment." I read that sentence dozens of times. Eventually, I taped it beside my bed. None of us knew how important those words would become, because while everyone else saw a sick young woman fighting for her life, God was preparing a miracle none of us expected. One afternoon, approximately 3 weeks after the doctors had given their grim assessment, I underwent another round of testing. By then, these tests had become routine. Blood work, scans, monitoring, nothing unusual. At least that's what we thought. The next day, Dr. Turner entered my room carrying a folder. His expression looked different, confused, almost shocked. At first, I assumed the news was worse. My stomach tightened, but instead he sat down and stared at the paperwork. For several moments, he didn't say anything. Finally, he looked up. "Anna," he paused, looked down at the results again. "I don't understand this." My parents exchanged nervous glances. Neither of them spoke. The doctor continued. "Some of your numbers have improved." I blinked. Improved? That word hadn't been used in months. He shook his head. "Not slightly improved." His voice sounded almost bewildered. "Significantly improved." My mother immediately began crying. My father looked stunned. And honestly, I didn't know what to think. The doctor ordered additional tests, more scans, more evaluations. He wanted to verify everything. Part of him seemed convinced there had been a mistake. But over the next several days, every new test revealed the same thing. Improvement. Real improvement. Unexpected improvement. Impossible improvement. Soon other specialists became involved. Doctors reviewed charts repeatedly. Nurses discussed the results in hallways. Medical staff who had never met me suddenly became interested in my case, because nobody could explain what they were seeing. And the most astonishing results were still ahead. Within weeks, the hospital would witness something extraordinary, something that would leave even the specialists speechless, something that would force me to confront a question I never expected. Had God just performed a miracle? The following weeks felt like living inside a dream. For months, every doctor appointment had brought bad news. Every test seemed to reveal another problem. Every conversation felt heavier than the last. But now something had changed. The reports coming back from the laboratory weren't getting worse. They were getting better. At first, nobody wanted to celebrate. Not even me. We had experienced too many disappointments, too many setbacks, too many moments when hope appeared only to disappear again. So we remained cautious, careful, guarded. But deep inside, something was growing. Hope. The very thing I thought I had lost forever. One morning, Dr. Michael Turner entered my room with a stack of medical reports. This time he wasn't alone. 2 additional specialists followed him. The sight immediately made me nervous. Usually when multiple doctors appeared together, it wasn't good news, but their expressions were different. Not worried, confused, amazed. The lead specialist sat down. He opened the folder, then looked directly at me. "Anna, we've reviewed your latest scans several times." My heart pounded. The room became completely silent. My parents sat beside me holding hands. The doctor continued, "We cannot explain what we're seeing." For a second, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then he turned one of the scans toward us. Several areas that had previously shown serious disease activity looked dramatically different. The progression had slowed. Some areas appeared to be healing. Others looked almost normal. I stared at the images. I didn't understand all the medical details, but I understood the look on the doctors' faces. They were shocked. One specialist shook his head. "We've never seen this kind of response in a case like yours." My mother immediately began crying. Again. By this point, she had cried so much over the previous year that tears seemed to come naturally. But these were different tears. These were tears of hope. After the doctors left, the room remained quiet. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, my father spoke. "God is doing something." His voice cracked. I looked at him. For months I had watched him carry our family through the darkest season of our lives. He rarely showed emotion, but now tears filled his eyes, and somehow that affected me more than anything else. The next several weeks brought even more improvement, slowly, steadily, unbelievably. My strength started returning. Not all at once. Little by little. I could sit up longer, walk farther, eat more, sleep better. Simple things that healthy people take for granted suddenly felt like victories. One afternoon, a nurse named Sarah helped me walk down the hospital hallway. Just a few months earlier, I could barely stand. Now I was walking, slowly, carefully, but walking. As we reached the end of the hallway, she smiled. "You know something?" I looked at her. She laughed softly. "When you first arrived here, some people thought you wouldn't leave this hospital." Her eyes filled with tears. "But look at you now." I looked down at my feet, then back at her, and for the first time, I truly realized how far I had come. That night, I couldn't stop thanking God. Not because I understood everything. I didn't. Not because I had all the answers. I didn't. But because I could finally see His hand moving through my story. The following Sunday brought one of the most emotional moments of my life. After months in the hospital, I was finally healthy enough to attend church. Walking through those familiar doors felt surreal. People turned and stared. Some gasped, others started crying. A few simply stood frozen in disbelief, because many of them thought they would never see me there again. As worship began, I sat beside my parents. The music filled the sanctuary, voices rose in praise, and suddenly I couldn't hold back my tears. I remembered all the nights I had spent in hospital rooms, all the fear, all the pain, all the uncertainty, and now here I was, alive, worshiping, breathing, smiling. When the congregation sang Amazing Grace, I completely broke down. The lyrics hit me differently than ever before. Every word felt personal. Every line felt real. Because grace was no longer just a theological concept. Grace had carried me through the darkest valley of my life. After the service, dozens of people surrounded me, hugging me, praying over me, celebrating. But one conversation stood out. An elderly man named Harold approached slowly. He had attended our church for decades. He took my hand, then said something I will never forget. "Anna, your healing is wonderful." I smiled, but he wasn't finished. "The greatest miracle isn't what happened to your body." He pointed gently toward my chest. "It's what happened in here." For a moment, I didn't fully understand. Then it clicked. Before my illness, faith had been part of my life. Now Jesus was the center of my life. Before my illness, prayer was occasional. Now it was essential. Before my illness, I believed in God. Now I depended on Him. Completely. The physical healing was incredible, But the spiritual transformation was even greater. Months continued passing. My recovery accelerated. Each doctor's appointment brought more positive news. The disease that had once threatened my life continued retreating. Even the specialists remained amazed. Eventually, Dr. Turner sat down with my family for a final comprehensive review. I remember the moment clearly. Sunlight streamed through the office window. The room felt peaceful. The doctor reviewed the latest results. Then he leaned back in his chair. For several moments he simply looked at us. Finally he smiled. A real smile, the kind we hadn't seen from him in a very long time. "Anna," he said, "I honestly don't know how to explain this." My mother immediately grabbed my hand. The doctor continued. "Medically speaking, what has happened is extraordinarily unusual." He paused, then added something remarkable. "Sometimes there are things we simply cannot explain." The room became silent, and deep inside, I knew exactly who deserved the credit. But the biggest surprise of all was still waiting for me. Because God hadn't just healed me for my own sake. He was about to use my story to impact countless other lives, and the moment that revealed his purpose would leave me in tears. As my health continued improving, life slowly began returning to normal. At least, that's what I expected. But God had different plans. You see, before my illness, I had always imagined success in a certain way. Graduate college, build a career, get married, travel, accomplish goals, create the perfect life. But after everything I had been through, those dreams looked different. Not because they were wrong, but because I finally understood something I had never understood before. Life is fragile. Every breath is a gift, every day is a blessing, and every moment belongs to God. About 6 months after leaving the hospital, Pastor James asked me a question. "Anna, would you be willing to share your testimony with the church?" Immediately, my stomach tightened. Public speaking terrified me. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of people seemed impossible. But after praying about it, I agreed. The following Sunday arrived faster than I expected. I stood behind the church stage curtain trembling. My hands were shaking, my heart pounded. I considered running back to my car. Then Pastor James placed a hand on my shoulder. "Just tell them what Jesus did." Simple words, but exactly what I needed. A few moments later, I walked onto the stage. The sanctuary was full. Families, friends, church members. Many of them had prayed for me during the darkest season of my life. I looked across the room, then I began speaking. At first my voice shook, but as I shared my story, something happened. The fear disappeared. I told them about the diagnosis, the hospital stays, the nights of despair, the prayers, the fear, the peace God gave me, and the healing that followed. Many people cried, including me. When I finished, the sanctuary sat in complete silence. Then people stood, one after another, until the entire church was on its feet. Not for me, for God, for His faithfulness, for His mercy, for His goodness. That morning changed everything. Because after the service, several people approached me. One woman said she had stopped praying years earlier. Another man said he was struggling with depression. A teenage girl told me she felt hopeless about her future. And somehow, through my story, God had spoken to them. Driving home that afternoon, I couldn't stop crying. Not because I was sad, because I was overwhelmed. For so long I had wondered why God allowed me to suffer, why He allowed the pain, why He allowed the fear, why He allowed the uncertainty. And now I was beginning to understand. My story wasn't just about healing, it was about hope. Over the next year, opportunities continued appearing. Churches invited me to speak. Youth groups invited me to share my testimony. Christian conferences asked me to tell my story. Everywhere I went, people approached me afterward. People carrying invisible battles. Cancer patients, parents who had lost children, young adults struggling with anxiety, families facing impossible situations, and again I heard the same words. "Your story gave me hope." Each time someone said that, I remembered the hospital room. The fear, the hopelessness. The moment doctors believed there was nothing left they could do. And I realized something beautiful. God never wastes pain. Never. The suffering we want removed immediately often becomes the testimony that helps someone else survive. One evening, nearly 2 years after my recovery began, I received a message on social media. It came from a young woman named Rachel. She was 20 years old, living in Ohio, fighting a life-threatening illness. Her message was simple. "Anna, I heard your testimony 6 months ago. At the time, I had completely lost hope. I was angry at God. I wanted to give up, but your story helped me keep believing. Tonight, my latest tests showed improvement. Thank you for sharing what Jesus did in your life. I sat staring at my phone. Tears filled my eyes. Then I began crying. Because in that moment, I understood something profound. The miracle wasn't over. The miracle was still happening. Not only through my healing, but through every life being touched by the story. A few months later, I returned to the hospital where everything had happened. The same hospital, the same hallways, the same building where doctors once believed my future was slipping away. Walking through those doors felt surreal. Memories flooded back. The fear, the tears, the prayers, the long nights, the uncertainty. As I walked through the corridor, I recognized a familiar face, Nurse Sarah, the same nurse who had helped me take those first difficult steps during recovery. The moment she saw me, she smiled, then hugged me tightly. "You look amazing," she said. I laughed. "So do you." We talked for several minutes, then she said something that deeply moved me. "Anna, your story still gets talked about around here." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" She smiled. "There are nurses and doctors who still remember your case." Then she lowered her voice. "Some of them still call it a miracle." My eyes filled with tears. Not because I needed validation, not because I needed people to agree with me, but because I remembered the hopeless girl who had once stared at a hospital ceiling and whispered, "Jesus, if you're there, I need you now." And he had answered. Not necessarily in the timeline I wanted, not in the way I expected, but he answered, more beautifully than I ever imagined. Today, as I sit here in my parents' home in Indiana telling you this story, I am 22 years old, healthy, strong, alive, but more importantly, I am closer to Jesus than I have ever been. Sometimes people ask me the question I hear most often. Do you really believe it was a miracle? My answer is always the same. Absolutely. Not because doctors couldn't explain everything, not because the recovery surprised medical experts, not because the circumstances were extraordinary. I believe it was a miracle because of what happened inside me. You see, before my illness, I knew about Jesus. After my illness, I knew Jesus. Before my illness, faith was part of my life. After my illness, faith became my life. Before my illness, I trusted myself. After my illness, I learned to trust God. That transformation is the greatest miracle I have ever experienced. Maybe you're listening to my story right now from a hospital bed. Maybe you're facing a diagnosis that terrifies you. Maybe you're carrying grief, fear, anxiety, heartbreak. Or maybe you've already lost hope. If that's you, I want you to hear something. Your story is not over. The chapter you're in right now is not the final chapter. God is still writing. God is still working. God is still moving. And even when you cannot see his hand, you can trust his heart. Because I learned something in the darkest season of my life. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't begin when everything gets better. Sometimes they begin in the moment you surrender completely to Jesus. Looking back now, I wouldn't wish that suffering on anyone, but I can honestly say God used it for good. He used the pain to deepen my faith. He used the fear to teach me trust. He used the uncertainty to reveal his presence, and he used the impossible to display his power. So if you remember anything from my story, remember this. Doctors may reach the end of their ability. People may lose hope. Circumstances may seem impossible, but God has never been limited by human limitations. Never. And as long as God is writing your story, there is always hope. Because the same Jesus who walked on water, the same Jesus who healed the sick, the same Jesus who raised the dead, is still working miracles today, and my life is proof of it. I once sat in a hospital room believing my story was ending. Instead, it was only beginning. And every single day since then, I would wake up with tears of gratitude and one simple prayer on my lips. Thank you, Jesus. Because when doctors gave me no hope, a miracle happened.